Welcome to episode 308 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Barry Black, who served in the FBI for 31 years. He was assigned to the Oklahoma City field office, where he investigated complex financial crimes for the first half of his bureau career before being certified as a special agent bomb technician, SABT, and reassigned to the Oklahoma City's Joint Terrorism Task Force. In this episode, he'll review two cases. The first one, a medical supply investment fraud case, where investors nationwide were duped out of more than $1.4 million. The case was highlighted on an episode of the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. In the second part of the episode, he'll review the initial steps he took when responding to the Oklahoma City bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, where the lives of 168 people, including 19 children, were lost. Barry, who was recognized as a master bomb technician, shares how this tragic event, his first as a certified bomb tech, affected the rest of his bureau career. Barry served as an adjunct faculty member at the FBI Academy, a subject matter expert for the U.S. State Department, and an instructor for NATO's Center of Excellence. He has been a guest lecturer at police departments and military academies around the world, including Scotland Yard. Since retiring from the FBI, Barry is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Central Oklahoma's Forensic Science Institute. He has served as a consultant and provides commentary on national and international events for media outlets such as the BBC, the History Channel, Fox News, CNN, and was recently a guest on the TV show True FBI. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to remind you that there's no episode next week, but I will be posting 3 in a row later in February. Make sure you follow FBI Retired Case File Review wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any shows between now and when I return to my every other week schedule in March. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI in books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and print books wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent, Barry Black. Hey, Barry, how are you?
Hey, Jerry, it's good to hear you.
I think for people who know you, they're going to be a little surprised that I'm not going to go right in to a case that involves you being a bomb tech, because that's how they know you. They know you as a bomb tech and a member of the SWAT team as a sniper who's been a part of some of the FBI's major investigations, such as Waco or Oklahoma City bombing. But I was surprised when we talked to learn that's not how you started out in the FBI.
Right. I joined the FBI as an accountant and spent about the first decade working primarily white-collar crimes.
So that's when I came up with the thought that maybe we would talk about two cases, a little something probably different than what they know you worked during your career. We would talk about a medical supply investor scam that you worked earlier in your career. And then I thought we would talk a little bit about the Oklahoma City bombing, because that occurred when you were actually assigned to Oklahoma City, and it was after you had become a bomb tech. Now, we've already covered Oklahoma City bombing in episode 61 and 62, where we talked to John Hershey and Larry Tongate. But I think we could probably talk about that again, just from the aspect of a bomb tech. I know that's a lot to cover, but how does that sound?
That sounds great. There was a period where I was wearing three hats: white collar, the tactical part as a sniper, and as a bomb technician. And some of these larger cases sort of overlapped. So I think that'll be fine.
One of the reasons I wanted to do the scam case is because it was actually an episode on Unsolved Mysteries.
Right. Yeah, that was a tool available to us back in the 90s. It was a very popular TV show. In this case, I think we have to look at when it occurred. This was in a time before the internet, before cell phones. So our access to the public was primarily through TV shows such as Unsolved Mysteries, and it was a huge assistance in this case.
All right, so where do you want to start?
I guess we'll start at the beginning. This was a unique case. My background is as an accountant. I joined the Bureau as an accountant, made the jump to explosives and counterterrorism about halfway through my career, but the first decade or so was primarily spent working kind of complicated white-collar crimes, and this fell into that description just because of the nature of the crime. I was out with Secret Service for a visit from President Bush 41, and my pager went off. The pager was the height of technology at the time, so I found a payphone, called the office, and was told there was what looked to be a pretty fast-moving, high-dollar, white-collar case in progress being run out of Oklahoma City. I got assigned that investigation, went to the office, and sort of began that initial preview of information that was coming in from across the country.
And what was that?
As you'll remember, Jerry, we used to call it the Office of Origin. So wherever a crime occurred would be the best place for the Bureau to work that investigation out of the 56 offices around the country. Complaints had come in from all over the U.S. from investors that felt they were being defrauded. The common link was the headquarters for the office of the suspect company was here in Oklahoma City. So those complaints were funneled to our office, landed on the white collar squad where I was working, and I got the ticket to work the case. So I began reviewing those complaints. It was a handful, but usually not everybody that's duped wants to file a complaint. A lot of people are embarrassed, don't want to admit that they were taken, particularly the elderly. And that's why I give a lot of talks here. We have to watch out for the elderly population who may be a little more susceptible to these kinds of scams. I started looking at the complaints, realized there was going to be a large volume of people. The office of the subject business was located on one of the main thoroughfares called Broadway in Oklahoma City. And the company research I conducted showed that this was incorporated as a sole proprietorship, a brand new company in Oklahoma City that was designed as a medical distributorship. It had, in fact, been registered with the state by a man named Richard Condia. Again, the time was not a lot of cameras. There wasn't a lot of checking. You could show up with, I believe it was $25 and some form of ID and open your business. So this man, known as Richard Condia, opened the business and then as Fidelity Medical, rented a warehouse with some office space, a large fenced-in secure storage area, and then put ads in 90 newspapers across the country. Newspapers, again, were the way this kind of business was operated in the 90s because the internet just wasn't available. So the ads in the papers were seeking investors to become distributors for Fidelity Medical. The minimum required investment was $18,000 up to $54,000. And if potential investors were interested, they could speak to a local salesman. Fidelity had hired a handful of people around the country to steer these investors towards Fidelity. The salesman didn't even know who they were working for. They were just paid a commission if they could get people kind of on the hook. Again, before the internet, these investors tried to do their due diligence. They contacted the state of Oklahoma, found that Fidelity was in fact registered with the state. They called the Better Business Bureau, the credit bureaus, but all those agencies can do is report any derogatory information. And there wasn't any because the company really was brand new and hadn't done any business. So what do you do next? You're in North Carolina or California thinking of investing your life savings. You want a little more confidence that this is a legitimate deal. So they were provided references, telephone numbers for satisfied customers that were making money hand over fist by being a distributor for Fidelity Medical. Well, they would call the references and were told these glowing stories about how much money they were making. Turns out they were just talking to the co-conspirators using aliases and a list of different phone numbers. But the final straw that pushed most of these investors over the top was an invitation to come visit Fidelity's world headquarters located in Oklahoma City. They would fly in, be picked up in a chauffeured limousine, taken to the corporate headquarters there on Broadway, where they met a young man who said he was the manager. They would invite him in. There was this giant wall-size world map with blinking lights showing all the global operations of Fidelity around the world. He would take them into a telephone phone bank where people were taking orders and processing orders, and then he would let them see the warehouse. He told them, you can't go in, it's an OSHA violation, but we'll let you look through this tiny little window into the warehouse operation. So they would look and see shelves of crates and boxes marked as medical supplies, dollies and forklifts, employees moving about all this product. And it seemed legitimate. So in just a matter of weeks, about 300 people had invested well over $1 million in this operation. Once the investors were convinced that this was a legitimate operation, a way for them to make some money, they would submit their funds, their investment funds, to this manager, a young man named Mike. Mike's the only person they really saw. Time goes on, and the investors never received any medical supplies. They were not getting any return on their investment, so they started to file complaints with Mike. Mike would egg them on, give them excuses. Today we'd call it supply chain issues. He would just stall them for a while, all the time taking in more and more money. Eventually, enough of the investors began to believe they were defrauded, and that's when they contacted local police and FBI. Those are the complaints that ended up on my desk and sort of started the entire investigation.
Now, you said there were medical supplies. Could you explain that exactly? What was it they were supposed to be supplying to these investors?
There was never any real delineation about what the product was. They were various medical supplies that Fidelity would manufacture overseas and then provide to their distributors for resale. But exactly what those supplies were, no one ever knew.
So these investors had nothing to do with the distribution. They were just investing in it and would make money from the sale of these supplies to distributors.
Right. So the investors were putting in their money to actually buy a distributorship. They would make money in turn as the products were sold in their region. They were buying a region for Fidelity to operate in, but there were no medical supplies. Nothing was being sold. And they became suspicious when all they were getting was lip service from this young man, Mike, in Oklahoma City, and filed complaints with their local FBI office. So I had each of them interviewed individually, all the complainants, and that provided enough probable cause to establish for a judge that we could get a search warrant. Early one morning in February of '92, we executed the search warrant. In white-collar cases, information is critical. I had enough agents to interview every employee. There were 25 at the time. Simultaneously and individually. We broke them away from the group so that we could get their independent recollections of what was going on. And what we found out was Mike was the only person they knew as an executive. Nobody had seen any of the other bosses. So I interviewed Mike myself. He was a young man, college age, and he almost seemed relieved when we came. He told me that he was in college, had answered an ad in the newspaper, again, which is how people found jobs then. He was interviewed by a man at an airport bar down in Oklahoma City and was told that a man named Richard Condia was the international organizer of this company called Fidelity Medical Supply, and they wanted a local manager for the corporate headquarters, and they thought that Mike would be perfect. Although he knew he was not qualified to run a business like that, the money was too good. They offered him a ton of money, so he accepted. He said, well, what do I need to do? Well, this man said, we've already got an office set up. Just show up at the office and hire a staff of a couple of dozen people. Mike said, I don't have the background to hire people. He goes, no, just hire some of your college buddies. We're going to pay them well. My assistant, a man named Barry Kent, will start calling you with instructions. You don't have to worry about it. He'll tell you what to do. So with the promise of huge money, Mike went, started the business, hired some of his college buddies. And sure enough, this man named Barry Kent began to call every day, sometimes multiple times a day, with very specific instructions about how to court these investors. Make sure you show them the giant map, talk about how big Fidelity is on the global market, let them see the boxes, and the money will flow. He did that for a while, but then got tired of all the complaints. He knew it was a scam because all the boxes that they were moving around were empty. So he told Barry Kent, you know what? I'm getting too much heat. People are complaining. The staff's going to quit. I'm going to quit. This just isn't working out for us. So Mr. Kent said, don't quit. Things are going great. We're just having some international issues with our suppliers. We're working with U.S. Customs to bring all of our equipment to U.S. shores. Mr. Candia is going to send another associate down. He's going to authorize raises if you guys will just keep working. So sure enough, a couple days later, another man shows up, only meets with Mike, and convinces him to stay on with the promise of more money. Mike then tells his staff, more money's coming if you'll stay. So the operation just continued to roll until we executed that search warrant. At the warrant, we found documents. We found the original lease for the warehouse itself. We found client lists, which gave us a huge number of other investors. We found bank records, which allowed me to trace some of the money. And the interviews also gave us other employees, which had left because they were already suspicious. So the story was all the same. The boxes were empty. There were never any supplies. The investors were being duped into thinking this was a viable, legitimate operation. Using the bank records, I traced about $250,000 that was run through a number of accounts as instructed by Barry Kent that ended up at a precious metals dealer down in Texas. The precious metal dealer said, yep, about $250,000 was exchanged for gold Krugerrands by a man named Richard Candia. So again, we didn't have a photo of Candia. There were no cameras there, but we got a sketch of a guy, nondescript, male, supposedly spoke with a bit of a Spanish accent, which matched with what the state officials had found when the sole proprietorship was established. But we had no real idea who Candia was. We also found telephone toll records in the search. Again, before cell phones, we relied on hardline records. One of the phone numbers that was often called by Mike went to a phone in North Carolina. We sent agents to North Carolina. It belonged to a low-level, kind of well-known con man. He was braced and said, look, I don't want anything to do with some $1 million fraud. The guy you're wanting is named Tom Flanagan. We didn't know the name Tom Flanagan, didn't know if that was an alias. We weren't completely sure if this guy was being honest with us because of his background, but at least we had a name. So as we're sort of looking for Tom Flanagan, I had sent that original lease that we recovered in the search to the FBI laboratory. One of the fingerprint examiners was able to recover one viable latent print on the bottom left corner of that lease. We ran that through AFIS, which is the Automated Fingerprint Information System out of the CJIS division, and it came back to a known con man named Harold Frederick Kruger. So we were looking for Freddie Kruger. Did a little research into Mr. Kruger's background. Out he had been associated with a man named Thomas Alfred Flanagan in a nearly identical scheme in Mobile, Alabama in 1980 called Southern Medical Supply. So we were pretty confident Harold Frederick Kruger, Thomas Alfred Flanagan were the guys we were looking for. We didn't know where they were, but we did secure an indictment, 16-count indictment, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Money laundering was new. It had only been on the books since 1986, and it was a pretty big hammer as far as sentencing goes, but you had to prove what we call specified unlawful activity, some other activity that led to the laundering of these funds. So I was able to prove that. Grand jury indicted both men, but they were fugitives. We didn't know where they were. So that's when I was able to get the case featured on Unsolved Mysteries. I flew out with an IRS agent that was working the case with me. We went to the studios, talked to the callers, got hundreds of calls about Flanagan and Kruger, not one mention of anybody named Candia. So based on the calls, we found Harold Frederick Kruger down near San Antonio. He was arrested, oddly enough, with gold Krugerrands in his pocket. And it took about 4 months to find Tom Flanagan. He was arrested outside Atlanta. And in researching his immediate past prior to the arrest, we found that he had cashed about $50,000 worth of gold Krugerrands at a precious metals dealer in Atlanta as well. Obviously, gold is fungible, it's untraceable, there are no serial numbers. So that helped us prove this idea that they were trying to hide the source of the money. Both men went to trial. Mr. Flanagan tried to get severance where they'd be tried separately. The judge denied that motion. They were tried together, and both men were ultimately convicted on all 16 counts and received roughly 9 years in prison with some restitution. And usually after the conviction, that's the end of cases, particularly in white-collar cases. This one took another strange twist in that one day I was sitting in the office and the U.S. Marshals called me, which doesn't happen. The Marshals look for fugitives that escape from prison, for instance. They said Flanagan had been sentenced to a minimum security facility to serve his time, but they found his orange prison jumpsuit out by the side of the road one day and he had vanished. They had searched his cell, found a book on how to speak Spanish, as Mr. Candia was known to speak Spanish, and some letters from his daughter, who, as I recall, lived in North Carolina. So I said the daughter's probably the best lead. There was another tied in North Carolina with the other con man. So deputies were searching for Flanagan in a small town, North Carolina, interviewed the daughter. She said, no, I haven't seen him, but he does like this one particular brand of cigar. He smokes this one brand of cigar. U.S. Marshals looked around town. There were only a couple of places that sold that brand. First gentleman, the proprietor, said, nope, I don't know Thomas Flanagan, never seen him. The second guy says, oh, yeah, he's in here all the time. As a matter of fact, that's him pulling up across the street. So
No.
deputies and local police go out to the car, order him to turn the car off, get out. Instead, he throws it in drive, tries to run him over. There's a chase. He's eventually caught, sentenced to a higher level of security with a few extra months for the escape. But that was just another unusual twist to what was a pretty strange case. Fast moving. We recovered about $150,000 of the investors' money. We never found all the gold. They spent about $365,000 just to keep the fraud going. The limo, the office space, the employees, $285,000 in employee pay to the salesman and these people in Oklahoma City. So they spent a lot of money to perpetuate the fraud, but got away with several $100,000 as well. And then the mystery is Richard Candia. As I said, out of the hundreds of calls we took from Unsolved Mysteries, no mention of Candia. We have a sketch of him. My personal opinion doesn't really matter, but he looks a little bit like Tom Flanagan to me. The witnesses said Candia spoke with this Spanish accent, and the correctional folks found the How to Speak Spanish book in Tom Flanagan's cell. So infer what you will about who Mr. Candia was. I think he was an absolute fabrication, just somebody made up to perpetuate this scheme and distance Kruger and Flanagan from the operation itself.
Did you mention how much time Flanagan and Kruger received initially?
They were both convicted at trial and got a little over 9 years. That money laundering charge, which again was pretty new at the time, we were able to convince the jury that obviously they had laundered the money from the proceeds of the fraud, but that put them up to about 9 years each in prison.
I'm surprised that they decided to go to trial. It sounds like you had a boatload of evidence and testimony against them.
When you go to trial, it's a delicate ballet. Con men love to talk, and they often think they're a lot smarter than everyone else. So they both opted for trial. We did have a great deal of evidence. That fingerprint of Freddy Krueger was going to be hard to get around. But when that operative came to convince the staff to stay on board, he said, not only am I going to give you a raise, I'm going to increase our phone bank. This is the early 90s. They have to have a repairman and phone installer come out. This phone installation guy dealt with this Fidelity rep. When I interviewed him, he picked out Frederick Krueger as the man with whom he had dealt. We're working with mugshots and photos from the 1990s. So we did what's called a photo spread or a photo array. Usually that's 6 photos, 5 people that look like your subject and the subject himself. This ID was going to be so critical, we used an 8-person photo array to make sure he was picking out the right guy. So the first time we showed him those 8 photos, he immediately picked out Freddy Krueger. The assistant U.S. attorney wanted to be positive about that ID, so we did a second separate 8-position photo spread. The repairman picked him out again without any problem. But at trial, this is why people like to go to trial, the defense attorney was cross-examining the phone installer. He said, you've identified my client, is that right? Yes. Is that him right here at the table? Yes. This defense attorney spun on his heels and said, are you sure it's not this man? And pointed to a guy that was standing up in the back of the court that really looked a lot like Mr. Krueger. And the witness said, you know what? Yeah, maybe that is him. So he lost all credibility as an eyewitness putting Krueger in the business. But again, what Mr. Krueger couldn't get around was his fingerprint on the lease of the warehouse.
Ah, there you go. Going to trial is tricky, not just for the prosecutive team, but luckily it worked out for you in this particular case. But in most cases, it doesn't work out that well for the defendant, because when you make the government go to trial, then at the end, you pay the price.
Well, there was so much information that the unique thing about this, again, this predates digital imagery. Now everybody's got cameras everywhere. Back then they didn't. So we didn't have a picture of Richard Candia. They had gone to great lengths to insulate themselves from the public and even from the Fidelity employees. The only people the employees knew was Mike, this college kid. The only people the investors had dealt with was Mike. However, in another unique identification case, the people that had opted to be picked up at the airport by the limo, they said in a photo spread that Fred Krueger was the chauffeur. Now, he never went inside, so Mike never saw who the chauffeur was. So they went to great lengths to insulate themselves so that the fewest people possible would be able to identify them physically.
That's really fascinating, all the things that they did in order to convince the people to invest. And what was the usual investment? How much were they looking to get?
The minimum investment was $18,000. The maximum was $54,000. There were tiers that you could invest in. Some people, it was their life savings they invested. Again, they had done their due diligence. They'd contacted the state, the references. They had physically flown out here, seen the operation. It was a very thorough con game. It was really a pretty fast-moving thing. Once we developed the PC for that search warrant, analyzed the bank records, traced the money, showed it was laundered, got it on Unsolved Mysteries. We had Kruger in a matter of weeks and 4 months to get Flanagan. It was a pretty fast-moving case.
That was really interesting. And I'm going to try to see if I can find that Unsolved Mysteries show. Sometimes you can find one of those old episodes on YouTube. Have you seen it?
After you spoke with me about this case, I did find it. It's really quite interesting. Looking back that far into the past with technology and the limitations we had, it was a fascinating case, and the Unsolved Mysteries callers were a big help.
All right. So you're going to have to send me the link so I can put the link in the show notes for this episode so we can all check it out. I'm sure there'll be a couple of laughs for attire and things like that.
Sure, a lot of wide ties and big hair.
Oh, I remember it well. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about your bomb tech career. I did tease a little bit at the beginning that about halfway through your career, you put that accounting degree aside and you moved from investigating white collar crime cases. You were already on the SWAT team, but now you decided to become a bomb tech. You have to tell us how you made that transition.
The transition from white collar to SWAT to explosives was just a strange timing event. I got in the Bureau when I was very young. I was 24 years old when I was sworn in. Since I was a kid, I wanted to be an agent. And the coolest thing I knew of at the time, because of TV and movies, was to be a sniper on the SWAT team. I got in the Bureau pretty young because of my accounting background. When I was eligible, tried out for the SWAT team, was able to get selected for that. Somehow made it to sniper school, which was sort of my dream, what I wanted to do, and thought I was happy. The tactical teams then were a secondary duty. It wasn't a full-time job within the Bureau. So I worked white collar and did the SWAT part. The biggest deployment was to the Branch Davidian standoff down in Waco in '93. And that's where I really met the first FBI bomb technician. After the fire, FBI bomb techs came down in case there were some unexploded ordnance there. I didn't know we had a bomb program. Turns out we certify all the non-military bomb technicians in the country. I asked the bomb tech, Jim Norman, who was a good friend of mine then, what do you do? He said, well, we train, we travel the world, we blow stuff up. I thought, that sounds like something I want to do. That's a very small subset of the agent population. There are only about 220 FBI bomb techs really in the world at any one time. Somehow I got selected in 1994, finished up at the Hazardous Devices School in Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. When I went through in '94, it was basically 2 Quonset huts in a field, and the explosive ranges were on the outskirts of the post. You'd take an old Bluebird bus out there. Over time, it has evolved into a world-class, state-of-the-art facility. Most recently, a $26 million upgrade, brought in Hogan's Alley-type villages where we can actually deploy live render safe tools. Scenarios back in the day, we had to imagine a bank or imagine a train station. Now there is actually a bank, there's a train station, there are planes. So the training's become much more realistic, just as the tools have become much more complicated. And my first case, a year and a week later, was the bombing of the Murrah Building here in Oklahoma City. Worked that for a couple of years, about 2.5 years, and the world was changing. Terrorism was becoming more prevalent. The FBI began to establish the Joint Terrorism Task Force concept. We had other accountants, but that strange blend of experience lent itself to my being transferred to the JTTF, Joint Terrorism Task Force. And so I spent the last half of my career as a police instructor and working international and domestic counterterrorism. Worked with State Department, NATO, our military partners around the world, and was deployed to every continent but Antarctica during my career. And it was fascinating. 31 years, I got to work white-collar crimes as well as some pretty high-value counterterrorism cases.
Very good. With the Oklahoma City bombing, you worked on that, but you also had a very personal connection to that. Where were you when you first learned that the Murrah Building had been bombed?
That morning, April 19th, I was still on the SWAT team. Myself and another operator were looking for a fugitive at Tinker Air Force Base, which was about 7 linear miles away. It was a beautiful morning. We were waiting to see if this fugitive would exit this particular building. Bomb detonated. It was extremely loud, registered 3.2 on the Richter scale, like an earthquake. I remember looking back over to the west, and a giant black cloud was already covering downtown. We had pagers still at the time, but our secure radios in the car began some chatter about maybe a plane crash or a gas main explosion. I'd been a bomb tech for 53 weeks, a year and a week. The FBI's evidence response team, crime scene investigation team, was relatively new. I'd been on the initial team there. So the assistant special agent in charge, he said, go do whatever it is you do. Anything like this was new. There'd been the first World Trade Center bombing prior. Showed up on scene. The building was destroyed. Glass was broken in about a 12-block radius. Around 300 buildings had been damaged. The personal connection beyond the people I knew in the building was my wife. She was a federal probation officer. Turns out she drove out of the building at 9 o'clock, 2 minutes before detonation. I didn't know she was okay until about 90 minutes later, she paged me back into my own voicemail at our office, which was at a remote location, and said that she and her office had been moved to their secure offsite. Yes, the grace of God, she's still with us. She left the garage at 9 a.m. This event, I've been to several pretty big terrorism events. It's just different when it's in your backyard. Back in 95, we still got paper paychecks. So every other Thursday, I was in that building talking to the young ladies that were tellers at the Federal Credit Union. They were all killed. We had other friends with other federal agencies that didn't survive. That was a very bleak time. I worked that case for about 2.5 years. 6, 7 days a week, 12 or 14-hour days. It was a lot of hard work by a lot of really diligent people, state, local, other federal agencies worked well as a team.
I covered the Oklahoma City bombing in a 2-part episode 61 and episode 62 with John Hersley and Larry Tongate. But that was really about the investigation of trying to find the people who were responsible for the bombing. But you had a unique part in this, and that had to do with the post-blast investigation. If you could take us through the steps. Here you are, you've only been a bomb tech for a little over a year. This had to be overwhelming when you walked up to the site. Even for somebody who had been a veteran bomb tech, it would have been overwhelming. What's the first thing that you did? I mean, what is it that you need to do immediately?
In these scenes, the most important thing is just to try to control the chaos. There is so much going on. There are victims that didn't survive. There's wounded, people that are trapped, walking wounded. You have to rely on your training to do your small part and presume everybody else is doing their specialized mission. But you're exactly right. It was overwhelming. This was about a 5,000-pound vehicle-borne IED. The only thing we had seen like it was the first World Trade Center bomb, which was about a 1,200-pound device. That was detonated inside the garage of the Trade Center, so it did about 6 floors of damage. This was a much larger device, detonated outside, devastating city blocks. When I first pulled up, just the magnitude, the scale of the damage, the amount of people that were clearly injured and had to have been killed was overwhelming. So other than basic first aid through the SWAT team, I really wasn't in a position to help any of the wounded because some were very critically wounded. My job was to try to determine, was this a gas main explosion? Was it a plane crash? Or was this a bomb? There was a giant crater, dead center of the building, did a perimeter walk around. Most of the evidence was located to the north and then east and west. There was nothing really far behind the building. It was clear this was not a plane crash. This wasn't a gas main explosion. This was an act of terrorism.
How is that clear? For those of us who haven't had the training, what was it that made you realize that this was definitely an explosive device that had gone off?
The training the Bureau provides is world class. So we've seen explosions. We had post-blast training, just nothing of this magnitude. So it had all of the telltale signs of a blast, the distribution of evidence, the vehicles across the street, how they had been pushed, the roofs of the cars across the street were in this V-shaped pattern, which we know is a function of overpressure. But it was clinched in my mind when A local deputy pointed out the rear axle of a truck. It had been blown about 600 feet. It exhibited blast damage. It indicated it had been very close to the seat of the blast or the point of detonation. We had found fragments of a truck, the frame rails, the wheels, in a distribution pattern that indicated the explosives were inside that truck. And just the sheer scale and magnitude of the detonation indicated that it wasn't an industrial accident of some type of chemical cylinder or something that may have accidentally or inadvertently detonated. It was obvious very early on that it was a large vehicle-borne IED.
One of the things that I talk about is the cliche that the FBI doesn't play well with others. This is one of those situations where you can assume that there is some tension about who's in charge and whose crime scene this is. You mentioned this detective who had pointed out the axle to you. I want you to take us to that scene on that day as well as you can and really go through the part that as a bomb tech you played.
The bomb tech community is very small. As I said, there are usually only about 220, maybe 225 FBI bomb technicians in the world at any one time. At that point, 1995, it was myself. I was brand new as a bomb technician. And my friend and mentor, Jim Norman, who had actually gotten me in the program after Waco. So there were two of us. But the national response system for bomb technicians is set up for this very instance. As I mentioned, there's only one bomb school in the country. That's the FBI's Hazardous Devices School. Every FBI bomb technician goes to that training, but we also train and certify every non-military bomb technician in the country. So when we show up on scenes, whether it's a small, say, pipe bomb at a bank, or a huge scene like this, or even 9/11, every bomb tech that shows up carries the same card, that same HDS card. We're trained the same way. A critical part of the FBI's counter IED mission is our state and local partners. So at the time, there were then there were 7 local police bomb squads throughout the state. Well, they all responded, just like every firefighter and policeman. Everybody with a badge and a gun came to help. But it was very helpful that I already knew all of these bomb technicians. We had breakfast together. I knew their families. So that close working relationship in the bomb tech community is critical. And you see that duplicated all around the country even today.
So when you get to the scene, how is it determined who is going to do what or what needs to be done?
Initially, on these big scenes, as I said previously, it's chaos. Everybody falls into their own specialty. If it's a bombing, then obviously you need bomb technicians. At a corporate level, a headquarters level, the jurisdictional issues are worked out. But at the tactical level, everybody, 99.9% of the time, is just doing what needs to be done. We're all in law enforcement. This was a horrible act. Our friends, families, neighbors had been killed and injured. So initially, the response is there's the immediate response, the medical response, evacuation, firefighters, but then there's that evidence gathering portion. So because of the system that's set up through the Bureau's Hazardous Devices School, as bomb technicians reported, we all knew kind of what had to be done. The searches were already in play because of training we had, joint training we had done together. But it's critical that the disparate agencies work well together. Oklahoma City is a relatively small place. Obviously, the Oklahoma City Police, the city agencies had a stake. The county had a stake. Statute dictates that it's a federal investigation. But unlike the movies, as you know, the FBI tries not to come in and say, we're taking over. The Bureau can bring in fantastic assets and resources, which we did, but it takes time, and we rely heavily on our state and local partners and those relationships that we try to develop before things are on fire that make the initial moments and hours after an event go much more smoothly.
Let's go through the collection of evidence. So as you're finding things, how are you collecting them? Talk about the chain of custody. Give me as much as you can about what you did as a bomb tech and how that played in the investigation.
So as far as evidence collection, now because of TV, everybody knows the term CSI. I wish we had come up with that acronym, but our evidence collection team was begun as the Evidence Response Team, or ERT. Very early on, ERT showed up. I was on ERT from inception, but as the bomb technician, we just get more post-blast training, evidence collection training regarding hazardous devices and hazardous evidence. So ERT showed up, our state and local partners showed up. We broke all those resources into individual teams, but on each team, an FBI representative would be present so that the FBI's collection process could be followed. It was presumed early on this was going to end up in federal court, so the federal rules of evidence were going to apply. ERT had some pretty good regiments as far as evidence collection. So in each team, there would be an FBI representative that would ultimately collect and process each piece of evidence and submit it to the FBI's Evidence Control Center, where a Bureau employee known as an evidence custodian sort of ran that entire warehouse. Records, the paperwork are critical. We had nearly 16,000 pieces of evidence during the course of this investigation. You don't know which are going to be important years later at trial. So each piece has to be collected properly, documented properly, and even stored properly so that it can be retrieved later. During the course of the investigation, Michael Fortier, one of McVeigh's friends, had said McVeigh told him what he was going to do, and he had shown him kind of his getaway route. Well, Fortier had lied to investigators early on, saying that he didn't know anything about the bombing. It turns out he did. And eventually he agreed to testify. But he had already lied to the Bureau, so it's natural for a jury to wonder if he is going to tell the truth or not. So we had to kind of resurrect his veracity a bit. So during the interview, he said that McVeigh had shown him his getaway route. He was going to use an alley behind the YMCA and use the big building as a blast shield in case the bomb went off early. So Jim Norman, my friend, the other bomb tech, went through 238,000 wet film 35 millimeter photographs and found an ERT close-up, which is part of our protocol, of a Ford key. Well, it's a Ford key. Out of all of the debris from hundreds of buildings being destroyed, our ERT found and recovered this one key. So we knew we were looking for a Ford truck because of that confidential vehicle identification number on the rear axle. Jim said, you know what, this might be the key. Go pull it out of evidence. So I went to the evidence custodian, roughly 16,000 pieces of evidence, said, I need this one key. She went to the shelf, handed me the key. Jim and I went down to Ford Motor, asked them to recreate the ignition from the truck based on the CVIN, and we showed that that key was the key that had delivered the bomb. The import of that is it was located in the alley behind the Y, right where Fortier said McVeigh was going to be. That evidence collection, one key out of 16,000 other pieces of evidence, we were able to place back in the alley where it was. We knew who had recovered it. We had pictures of it. And that's one way we were able to resurrect Fortier's veracity in his testimony. That morning, I arrived on scene. It was about 9:30, worked through the day. I had parked on the curb at the nearest intersection. That's as close as I could get without actually getting into the debris field. Back then, bombings were not that common. So I didn't have a truck with sufficient equipment. I was driving an Oldsmobile Calais. But I parked the Oldsmobile on the sidewalk, got what little gear I had out of the trunk, and just began the work. Later that day, an initial command post was established not far from the site. Eventually, a more permanent command post was established a little farther away. But those days go quickly. I really don't remember going home that night. What I recall, that evening after dark, it began to rain. For bombing crime scenes, rain's really not a good thing because it washes away that microscopic chemical residue that we like to find. But I went to my car to get some Gore-Tex because it was starting to rain pretty good. My car was gone. So, of course, I'm thinking, great, somebody's stolen my car. I'm sure that's going to be a memo of some kind. Had to call in the headquarters. Hey, look, my car's gone. They said, no, they've set up a triage center where you parked. We've towed it. It's 3 blocks away. So went and got my Gore-Tex. And as I said, I do not remember going home. So many of these cases, they're all consuming. You do what you do and you want to stay. It's difficult to make people go home. But yeah, it was a long and arduous process, but the systems in place, which have now gotten even better, sadly due to repetition, they worked well. We had a secure evidence collection facility attached to the command post. We had 24-hour security there, which when I was up in New York after 9/11 was similar. It was more robust then because of the threat. But you have to consider physical security, physical location. Eventually, somebody's got to pay for all this, so you need logistics and finance involved. All of these things have to be in place before the event so that you don't have to wonder, where are we going to get 500 computers? Where are we going to get a repeater for our secure radio network? Who's providing medical support, fire support, perimeter security? All of these plans need to be in place early on as some type of emergency operations plan so that each event can be handled based on its own unique circumstances as opposed to worrying about the logistics of your operation. So there's a lot of balls in the air at that time, a lot going on, but life goes on. These horrible events, They take a toll on all of us in the Bureau and other professions like this. You still have work to do and have to drive on and keep doing what you do.
Were you called to testify in any of the trials?
I made 3 trips to Denver for McVeigh's trial. Some were just physical security for witnesses and prosecutors, the courthouse itself. At the end, I was called to testify about one specific piece of evidence, and I got as far as the little anteroom right before you go into court, and defense stipulated. So I never testified in McVeigh's trial. I went to support that trial while still working some white-collar cases in Oklahoma City. McVeigh and Nichols were tried separately, and then Nichols was subsequently tried by the state of Oklahoma. Murder is usually not a federal crime, so there were only 8 deaths charged in the federal indictment. Those were the 8 federal agents that were killed in the bombing. Murder, most often, is a state crime. So after Terry Nichols was convicted federally, the state charged him for murder to represent all the other lives that were lost. I was called to testify in some of the state proceedings regarding Nichols, but did not testify at his trial.
Barry, I really appreciate you sharing with us your role in investigating the Oklahoma bombing. Now, we went over that very, very quickly. So, for those who are interested in learning more about your investigative role in the successful resolution of this case, I am going to link in the show notes for this episode a powerful interview and video that you did that's posted on the FBI website. As a matter of fact, there are lots of articles and videos featuring you and your role in the Oklahoma City bombing on the FBI website. So, I mean, that must have been so special to be recognized by the FBI that way.
Well, it was an honor. Obviously, these acts are horrific. And, during the investigative part, while you're deep in the case itself, of course, nobody's thinking about that type of recognition. But looking back, whether it was Waco or the Oklahoma City bombing, or most recently the 9/11 kind of awards ceremony they had in New York, it's humbling to be recognized by the Bureau. My work was really a small part of a huge team, and everybody was rowing in the same direction.
Well, I know, but come on. Having the Oklahoma City bombing investigation as your very first real life bombing event to respond to must have had a profound effect on your career as a special agent bomb tech.
It definitely did. I had been FBI bomb technician for just, I think, a year and a week when the bombing occurred. And it was a trial by fire, right? Of course, you learn just from the experience. You can go to the training, you can go to the schools, read academically, try to prepare yourself. But experience is sadly a good teacher, and the exposure to these events, I think, makes us all better in whatever venture we're undertaking.
Well, in 2011, you were one of the first of 4 special agent bomb techs to receive the designation of Master Bomb Tech. Could you tell us what the distinction is?
That, again, was a very humbling moment. But when the FBI first started with the bomb technician program back in the 70s, the world was a different place. We were basically extensions of the FBI schoolhouse at Redstone Arsenal then, and would go back annually, which is 3 times as often as our state and local partners would go back for training. So in theory, we were a liaison, a link. The bombings back then were mostly criminal, mafia-type bombings. There were a few weather underground type things, but the weapons have gotten much more complicated. So after the 93 bombing in New York, the 95 bombing in Oklahoma City, large vehicle bombs were becoming an issue. And then we started sliding into unconventional weapons, weapons of mass destruction, radiological devices, peroxide-based explosives like tristone triperoxide and some others. So that the training was elevated significantly. And then, as we mentioned, exposure to cases, domestic cases and international cases, offers some insight and experience. As the Bureau's footprint grew globally through that global war on terror, the Critical Incident Response Group that oversees the bombing program needed some way to kind of quantify the bomb tech's experience level, much like the military has various designations. But it was determined then that there would be a 4-tier system, And based on your academic training, deployments, case experience, sort of a witch's cauldron of background and experience, an applicant could be considered for that top tier, which is called a master bomb technician. And what was most important to me, being in that first group, was the nominees are vetted by a group of peers. So this was really a peer rating. And I was really humbled and honored to be in the first group of 4 that ever received that nomination. Actually, there were only 3 more thereafter, so a total of 7 in the Bureau before the whole program just sort of went away with a change in administration.
I know that we didn't have a lot of time to talk about post-blast and pre-blast and all of that, but I did have an opportunity to interview one of your colleagues in episode 86, Kevin Miles, who is also a master bomb tech.
Right. Kevin and I are good friends. We go way back. He started the large vehicle bomb post-blast school 3 years after the bombing here in Oklahoma City, and asked me to be one of the instructors for that course. He and I have spent a lot of time together in some pretty strange places. We've detonated some large devices. That training, that unique school, still carries on today. Kevin's retired. I'm now retired, but that's still a big component of that national and truly international scope that the Bureau can fulfill in a training gap.
Another indication of your expertise in this area, in addition to being named a master bomb tech, is the fact that you were inducted into the Oklahoma Law Enforcement Hall of Fame and presented with the Bill Tillman Public Service Award in 2014. How did that feel?
It was remarkable. Again, very humbling. What made that particularly special is that's a state Hall of Fame. So it was state and local law enforcement that nominated and inducted me into the state Hall of Fame. I believe myself and Special Agent in Charge Bob Ricks are the 2 living FBI agents they're in that Hall of Fame. And it was just a great honor. I was fortunate to spend my entire career in one office. So I got to Oklahoma City in 1988 and spent the entire 31 years here. So I made a lot of friends, worked a lot of cases with every level of state and local law enforcement. It was very, very humbling to be even nominated, but to get inducted was a special day.
It definitely was something special to be recognized by the state of Oklahoma. But you've also received national recognition. You received the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association Group Achievement Award in 2019. And I have to ask you about this one, an honorary U.S. Air Force Commander Award in 2022 because of your work with security forces and military dogs. Tell us a little bit more about that.
The U.S. military and the FBI have a long-standing and profound partnership. The FBI's Hazardous Devices School is at Redstone Arsenal, which is an Army post. And as you know, the Academy is a Marine Corps base. But as international operations became more and more of our daily menu, we began embedding with military units in different parts of the world. With the asymmetrical warfare that comes with that global war on terror, there needed to be a forensic piece. You know, soldiers are really good at taking care of the enemy and property, but in an asymmetrical venture, you still may need some forensic evidence. So we became partners on a really broad scale after these peroxide-based explosives became commonplace, used often by terrorists. They're so sensitive, they're difficult to train with. The explosive detection canines that the military relies on had never been trained on things like TATP or cousin HMTD because it's too sensitive. Nobody thought terrorists would use it because it's insanely sensitive, but we now know they use it routinely. So the Bureau entered into an agreement with the military whereby our chemists would create laboratory quality peroxide-based explosives, send that to us in the field, and then we would make it available in a safe environment to train in what they call imprint the military dogs, as well as our police explosive detection canines. From that, I got to talking with the kennel masters throughout the Southwest and realized that they didn't really have much of an opportunity to train on bulk explosives. They would train on relatively small quantities. And the canines were getting overwhelmed when they would come to a huge cache of explosives in theater. So I developed a mass odor program where we would bring in hundreds and hundreds of pounds of explosives and acclimate the dogs to that much of an odor. And actually got a letter from Iraq where that training was credited with locating a cache of explosives outside a forward operating base. So we can help in ways sort of unconventional, but we can help in those ways. During some of those meetings, some of the kennel masters told me that they're deployed via helicopter, Chinook or Black Hawk usually in combat theater. But a lot of times their dogs weren't acclimated to flight. They had never been on a helicopter before. So having been in Oklahoma for so long, I had contacts with the Army National Guard who flew Chinooks and Black Hawks. I wrote an MOU that was approved whereby those military working dog teams would get to fly combat flight operations simulations here in Oklahoma, either Napa the Earth with Black Hawks or confined space landings with Chinooks. As the program grew, installations from throughout the Southwest would come here to Oklahoma and take part in that combat flight training program. So it was sort of out of the box, but was well appreciated. And over the years, got the attention of one of the commanders at Tinker Air Force Base. And I was very honored to be awarded this honorary commander slot for the Air Force.
Where are some of the places where you are deployed as a bomb tech and master bomb tech?
Some are kind of off the beaten path, like Nepal or the Maldives out in the Indian Ocean. But I was in the Middle East 3 times, Somalia, Tunisia a couple of times after the Arab Spring, South Africa a few times, a lot of the former Soviet Union areas, Uzbekistan. I was in Ukraine after Crimea fell with our special forces, helping train the Ukrainian special forces. I've gotten to go to every continent but Antarctica. Worked with the Brits and their counterterrorism group. It's been fascinating. India, a subcontinent. It was unbelievable the types of things we got to do. I was able to do things I didn't know we could do.
Well, no wonder you are designated as a subject matter expert for the U.S. State Department and as an instructor for NATO's Center of Excellence. Kudos to you for that international recognition also.
Well, it's an honor, really, to get to do something you love and that really gives you a sense of contributing to a bigger goal or bigger purpose. It was rewarding, and that's why I stayed in the Bureau for over 31 years. I enjoyed the work and found it to be quite rewarding.
It's still all amazing if we go back to the very beginning when we talked about your medical supply investment scam and the fact that you started all of this because you wanted to become an agent and decided that the way to get in was to start out as an accountant. That accounting degree was definitely the key to what has become an amazing bureau career.
It worked out better than I could have imagined. It was kind of just being in the right place at the right time and trying to seize opportunities as they presented themselves.
Well, that certainly gives us an idea of the varied roles that you played in the FBI as a special agent. Definitely both unique roles that most people would not associate as one career. So you've done a little bit of everything. But I want to go back to my standard question, and you touched on it a little bit, but to get a better understanding of when and why you decided to join the FBI.
Well, it was basically a childhood dream. I had a baseball coach, a little league coach, that volunteered his time. He was an FBI agent, and I was just fascinated from that point forward. I stayed in touch with him through high school, and of course, he said you need a 4-year degree. He was kind, but he said, only about 5 or 6% of applicants get in, so basically have a backup plan, which was really good advice. Finished high school, started college as an engineer, called him back, said, hey, I'm still serious. He said, well, that's great, but we're really not hiring engineers. We're hiring accountants and lawyers. He said, of course, law school's 3 or 4 more years of school. But in the 80s, if you had an accounting degree, the FBI had an accounting program where they had an accounting exam, much like the AICPA exam. He said, if you can get an accounting degree and can pass that test, they'll waive the other requirement, which was 3 years of work experience in the private sector, and you can get in a lot quicker. So I changed majors from engineering to accounting. I actually changed schools, went down to Tuscaloosa, the University of Alabama. I got an accounting degree and was still too young to apply. So I had to work as an accountant for a while, which was not my dream job, but it paid the bills. When I was finally eligible to apply, I did. I was living in Norfolk at the time. Took the accounting test, somehow passed that, which made the special agents test available to me. Got past that, and then was sworn in at age 24 at Quantico. I was able to spend a little over 31 years doing a job I loved. Each day was different, and the change between white collar and tactical and explosives, really, it went so fast. It's hard to believe 31 years went by that quickly.
When did you retire, and what are you doing now?
I retired in December of 2019 after a little over 31 years. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. This was going to be a hard job to top, but there's a university nearby, the University of Central Oklahoma, that has the top-rated forensic science institute in the country. I was asked to join the faculty there. So now I teach college courses, forensic investigation of mass disasters and crime scene processing, those kinds of things I did for most of my career, to a group of students that I believe is going to be the future of this vocation.
You certainly have had a fantastic career, and it's great to hear that you are still using that knowledge, skills, and experience and paying it forward so that others can learn from your experiences, from your career. I like to give my guests the last word, which will also provide them with some insight that you've been able to gain over the years. What would you like to say?
Well, I think looking back on over 3 decades of this kind of work, generally people are good. I got to travel the world, meet counterterrorism operators, special units. As I said, I was an instructor for NATO, so I worked closely with the military. Generally, people are good. There are some bad apples out there that seem to kind of grab the headlines. There'll always be bad people, but I think there are more good people out there, and at the end, the good's going to prevail.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a headshot and bio for Barry Black, links to articles about that medical supply investment fraud case, including a link to the video clip of the Unsolved Mysteries segment the case was featured. There are also lots of articles and videos regarding Barry's unique role in the Oklahoma City bombing investigation, and Barry provided lots of photos from his bomb tech career. There are also links to previous FBI retired case file review episodes, 61 and 62, about the Oak bomb investigation, and episode 86 with retired agent Kevin Miles, a master bomb tech colleague of Barry's. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.